What's going on, guys? My name is Wade with TechDaily. So when it comes to the Samsung Galaxy A16 5G, there's really only two things you need to know. First, this will undoubtedly be not just Samsung's best-selling phone for 2025, but the best-selling Android phone overall worldwide. And it could potentially be the best-selling smartphone, period, outselling even the iPhone. We'll come back to that point momentarily. The second thing you need to know is that for about 90% of the general population, this is all the smartphone they really need. Now, let me expand upon my Premature Proclamation touting this phone as 2025's bestseller already. Looking past the outrageous interest this phone already has had on social media, when you see the sales numbers for the previous generations of this tier of A series, the A11, the A12, the A13, 14, and 15, they were all near the top of the bestseller list quarter after quarter, year after year. And I think it's only fair to assume that that will continue. I suppose in 6 to 12 months, you can come back to this video and tell me if I was completely wrong, but I don't think I will be because, and this is me expanding on my second point from a moment ago, this is a really familiar, really affordable smartphone from everyone's favorite brand that's, for all intents and purposes, just as good for scrolling through Instagram and texting your friends as something 4 times the price. Or it's at least not 4 times worse than the $800 S-series phone Samsung would probably prefer you buy instead. What you miss out on not getting that S-series phone probably isn't worth hundreds and hundreds of extra dollars. Of course, this A16 isn't the cheapest phone you can buy. It isn't even the cheapest Samsung phone, actually. It's also not the best budget phone when you consider its specs and capabilities, along with its limitations and omissions this year. It's not all that attractive or unique, and arguably, it isn't even that different from all its predecessors. But it's one of the very few affordable options we have here in the US. The Samsung name still sustains immense popularity everywhere else in the world. It's what people prefer to have. There's that convenience being within Samsung's ecosystem and the benefits of their software. And when you put all this together, and also remember just how many previous A-somethings are already out there being used by people who are considering an upgrade, I don't think there's any reason this won't be the #1 smartphone for 2025. Now, I want to talk more about this phone so you have a better understanding of what's new and different from the previous phones, what you can expect performance-wise, the limitations with this kind of device, and I want this to be sort of a group exercise. So if you have this phone or one of the previous A-series devices, let me know your experience in the comments below. Before that though, and I can't stress this enough, please protect yourself and your data online. ExpressVPN, this video's sponsor, is a great way to do just that. With ExpressVPN, you can hide your IP address, encrypt your network traffic, and be sure that doxers, advertisers, or anyone else with bad intentions isn't tracking your activity or stealing your info. You already know you should definitely use a VPN on public Wi-Fi networks like airports or coffee shops, but even at home, you should retain as much online privacy as possible. I use ExpressVPN 24/7 because I'm tired of the countless ads I see that seem like they're reading my mind. They're actually just tracking my every click. And I don't want my internet service provider logging and selling that info either. On a lighter note, ExpressVPN can also help you access movies and TV shows that aren't available in your region, or just bypass any other internet censorship or restrictions. With one click, you can change your IP address to a different country, and then voila, you get to see what you've been missing out on. Like, why does Germany get Goodfellas on Netflix and I don't? Or Rick and Morty in the UK? Well, now I get everything from everywhere. ExpressVPN has the fastest speeds, the most secure servers, 24/7 customer support, and a host of other features all baked into one app. Click the link in the video description below, scan the QR code on screen now, or go to expressvpn.com/td25 to find out how you can get 4 months of ExpressVPN for free. So one of the most enticing things about this tier of A series, and it's once again true with the A16, is that this phone at its full retail price, $199, is a fraction of the S-series phones. But more than likely, you'll get this A16 from a carrier or prepaid network for even cheaper, like $99. And by the summertime, it's usually a free phone with a new line. And I know there are plenty of deals and discounts for the flagships too, but at a glance, when you see the prices side by side, I think it's easy to understand why someone might pick up this phone first. When you do grab this A16, there's a few things you'll notice immediately. The first is its size. It's 6.7 inches this year, at least its visible screen area is, and that's a little bigger than the A15, which is great, but every other year, these A-series phones just sort of flip-flop back and forth between 6.5, 6.6, and 6.7 inches, so you may not even be able to tell a difference. It's not like you gain much in the end with what you're actually looking at, but I suppose it's nice that this phone is technically as big as the S24 Plus. Unfortunately, Samsung still refuses to give up this dated, budgety look with the old school camera notch and the thick, noticeable bottom chin, thanks in part to the older screen technology. It's not a phone that looks good by 2025 standards, but you'd be surprised by how many people are perfectly fine with this setup, especially if you've been using all the other A-series phones from the previous years. It's probably all you've ever known. Around back, Samsung basically decided a couple of years ago to make all their phones look exactly the same. So face down, if you had this A16 in a pile with an S24 or an FE or a higher tier A-series like the A55, you're not gonna tell any of them apart, which is cool. It's not like this phone looks cheap in the lineup, but it feels cheap since it's all plastic. No premium materials here whatsoever. The back is a simple glossy plastic cover. The sides and frame are a thicker plastic that mimics metal, but it isn't. And the front display glass actually doesn't seem to be anything special either. That's why there's so much glare and so many fingerprints. And it's one of the main reasons why this phone is so affordable. But for the first time on this tier of A-series, the A16 is now IP54 dust and splash resistant. So no, you shouldn't take it swimming, but if you accidentally get it a little wet, it'll be perfectly fine. Now, there's two things that people always want to see on these A-series phones. The first, fortunately, is still here. A micro SD card slot within the physical SIM card tray. This phone can be configured with either 128 or 256 gigabytes of storage, which isn't terrible, but the option and flexibility to add more storage via an inexpensive SD card is always nice. The other thing, well, you can see that big empty space. The headphone jack has been removed this year. I guess this was inevitable. It's been slowly taken away on each of the higher tier phones every other year, but I know it's still going to bug a bunch of people. Not everyone wants to deal with wireless earbuds. Even though Samsung has a bunch to sell you, I get that. But you can still get USB-C wired earbuds that'll do the trick if it's any consolation. So last year with the A15, Samsung made a big leap with the display in bringing a Super AMOLED panel to that phone. This year, unfortunately, the screen seems to be unchanged, aside from its slight increase in size. But that's not the worst news in the world. Your 6.7-inch viewing experience here consists of a 2340 by 1080 resolution Super AMOLED 90Hz panel, with a peak brightness of around 800 nits that you'll see only with auto brightness enabled and in action, mainly in outdoor use. Otherwise, the 400-ish nits of max user-controlled brightness will probably be the biggest complaint. If you can tolerate the glare, the colors and resolution are both great, and the 90 Hz refresh rate, while it isn't adaptive, still makes the phone look and feel kind of fast. I think for me, this is like the bare minimum standard of displays nowadays, no matter the price of the phone. It's a big screen, it's a colorful screen, you're not going to get any higher resolution than this, and it's still a better refresh rate than the iPhone. That's a bunch of wins, in my book. And it's more than enough to make most everyone happy. But I always like to say that it really does depend on your perspective and your previous smartphone experience. Like, of course, this screen looks dull, dim, and extra smudgy compared to the S24 Ultra. But for under $200, there's nothing about this viewing experience to me that's an outright issue, and I also don't know what else Samsung could have added that wouldn't have just overlapped the higher tier phones. Arguably, all Samsung phones should probably have a 120Hz 1080p Super AMOLED display that doesn't look like it's from 2018, but I'm sure the compromises here continue to just keep the costs down, which is probably the most important thing. And fortunately, Samsung didn't outright cheap out on what's probably the most important aspects of the smartphone. What I don't understand is why Samsung can't install what's probably a 1-cent part into this phone. You get just one bottom speaker, no dual stereo speaker setup like most other phones have, and the speaker here it's fine, but come on, a decent set of dual speakers when so many people listen to stuff out loud nowadays, and when you already took away the headphone jack, should have been the consolation prize. As far as performance, well, I'm sure most of you were waiting to or have already left some sort of comment saying that this phone is underpowered, laggy, or a hunk of junk because of a certain processor that was used on some of them. But here's the thing. If you have those thoughts about this phone, I don't think you were ever seriously considering it anyway. The A16, just like all its predecessors, is a device that's meant to do a little more than the bare minimum, but otherwise not blow you away or come out ahead in any speed tests. Inside, the A16 this year will have either the MediaTek Dimensity 6300 or Samsung's own Exynos 1330. How can you tell which one you're buying? Well, aside from checking the product info online and hoping it's correct, there's not really a definitive way. On top of that, there's 4, 6, and 8 GB configuration options for RAM for this phone, so spec for spec, it's kind of hard to make a straightforward comparison with last year's A15 because there's just a lot of factors in play here. By the way, there's also a 4G only version of the A16 with a different MediaTek processor entirely. I don't know why Samsung has to make this so confusing. I mean, do all the different countries and regions around the world really need these subtle differences in components? It seems unlikely. But in my experience with my A16, while this phone is a little slower to do most things compared to what I'm used to, it's a perfectly fine phone to get you through the day. It can scroll through your videos for hours on end. It'll be perfectly fine for Google Maps. You can jump from web page to text messages without losing your place most of the time. And as long as you're not coming from like an S24 Ultra, which I don't think you are, I can't imagine you're going to be too grumpy about how this phone feels. Again, it's all about perspective and your expectations. Can you game with the A16? Sure. I don't have a ton of issues playing some of the games I like. The launch and load screens take a little while, and you're not going to be enabling the high graphics settings more than likely. But you can pass the time at the doctor's office with your favorite titles. It's a perfectly fine, functioning smartphone for the vast majority of people who do basic stuff day in and day out. My saying is always, if you need to stay connected to the world, and maybe do a little more, that's what this phone is for. With that being said, there is also one more new advantage in opting for this phone. Not only is it currently running the full-featured Android 14 update with One UI 6.1, but Samsung says they'll push 6 major Android and One UI updates to this phone, which is a new record for this tier of A series. So if you like getting the latest version of Android, and you don't want to buy a new phone next year, the year after that, or basically until 2030, well, this A16 is still going to be running the latest software features by then. For a lot of years, it always felt that these cheap Samsung phones were one-year devices. Like Samsung just assumed you'd get a new, free, or cheap device every single year because they were free or cheap, and they kind of stopped working. But now Samsung seems totally fine with you keeping this phone for a long time, and I think that's awesome. You may as well, and if you spend full price for this thing, you're getting every dollar's worth and then some over the long run. One other way you can actually get your money's worth with this phone is by buying a 25-watt fast charger to pair it with. Samsung hasn't included a charger in the box for years now. We know this, but even this cheaper A16 supports the fast charging speeds. You paid for them when you bought this phone in a way, so you may as well enjoy it. You can go from 0 to 100% in under 2 hours, and the 5,000 milliamp battery should probably last you through the day anyway. This size battery is literally in every Samsung phone nowadays, at least the A series. And I know there's a lot of other factors at play, but I don't know anyone who can't get like 10 to 12 hours of screen on time with this phone, which is more than enough for most people. I've actually even seen comments saying these cheap A-series devices are 2-day phones, since a lot of folks just don't use these phones that much anyway, so that's great too. Finally, I've consistently said that the biggest compromise overall with a budget A-series phone like this one is the camera setup, and I think there's 2 explanations for this. One, flagship smartphone cameras have just been the main focus for Samsung, for Apple, for Google, and for all the other brands for years now. It's like the only thing they say they change on these phones. And the other thing is that Samsung really hasn't added or changed anything on these budget phones camera-wise. And that's a little odd. I mean, this is the exact same camera setup as last year's A15. The same 50 megapixel main lens, 5 megapixel ultra wide, and 2 megapixel macro, and the same 13 megapixel selfie lens. There's also the same set of shooting modes and features we've seen, I feel like, for 3 or 4 years, probably. And it's all fine. Like, you're not going to get a horrendous looking picture out of this phone, at least not in broad daylight. I think in low light, whether you use the dedicated night mode or not, this phone struggles. There's a ton of noise, the shadows are lost, dim pictures and nighttime shots probably don't look good if we're being honest, but generally speaking, you're not going to regret getting a picture of something important with this phone. It'll be just fine. But it's not a good camera setup by today's standards. The gap between this phone and a flagship is just so much wider, and it's missing a lot of critical things like better zoom, better video stability, 4K recording, consistent focus. Obviously, low light and nighttime shots are a bit of a miss. There's tons of ways in which the camera setup could be improved, and just like with the display, I feel like there could be a universal bare minimum standard that Samsung brings to all their smartphones for the cameras. This isn't it, and I'm surprised Samsung hasn't really changed anything here for the past few years. So all in all, I feel like I was pretty fair with this A16 when you consider both its limitations and its advantages. This is once again a budget phone through and through, and for those of us used to the top tier Ultras and other flagship devices, I mean, this just isn't a phone we'd ever be considering. But for most of the non-techie people, the general population, the average everyday consumer, this is a super affordable, familiar phone that accomplishes the tasks and asks that they would want. Whether you choose to believe it or not, the numbers say that this tier of smartphone millions of people will buy year after year. And regardless of the Exynos processor and the lack of a headphone jack, this A16 is probably going to be Samsung's best seller, and maybe even the best seller overall for all smartphones for 2025. But what do you guys think about the A16? Am I crazy? Am I wrong? Let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts, of course. Hopefully you guys did enjoy this video though. Be sure to follow TechDaily on Twitter and subscribe to the TechDaily YouTube channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys later.